You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you guys joining the show every single week. We have great news. Our website is now live. hazardground.com has a whole bunch of our previous episodes, tells you more about our guests. It has photos, has a place that you guys can eventually get some gear as soon as we get that part up and running. But just a great source of information and just another way for you guys to connect with the Hazard Ground Podcast. Also, don't forget to get on iTunes, give us a rating and review. That also helps us get the word out about the podcast. Follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're on all of them. I'd love for you guys to check us out there as well. We have an absolutely fantastic guest this week, and it is our first Medal of Honor recipient. His name is Ryan Pitts, and he was involved in the Battle of Wanat in Afghanistan, and he joins us now on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Ryan, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, I don't know where to start because you're our first Medal of Honor recipient, so there's a lot to get to here, obviously. But let's start at the beginning. How did you get into the military? Why did you join?
Oh, how did I get in? So, I mean, I was just listening to other podcasts, that you guys have done over the years and listened to, other people's reasons. And I know September 11th comes up a lot because that was my generation. That's why we went to war. But I was a junior, I think, when September 11th happened. And when I think back on it, I live in southern New Hampshire, grew up in southern New Hampshire. It's kind of sheltered up here. And, I think that the events at that time, it didn't fully hit me. I didn't fully understand what it all meant. And fast forward to my senior year, and it starts coming time to make a decision. All my friends are getting accepted to college, and it's time to make that big decision. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? And I didn't feel like I had any firm grasp on it. I didn't know what I wanted to go to school for. I knew that, my parents could help out, but, I didn't want to waste their money while I went and tried to figure it out. And some of my friends had enlisted and were looking at it and figured, you know what, I can go serve my country. It'll buy me some time. It'll help me pay for school. And that was really my impetus at the time. I guess it was trying to delay an adult decision and get some money for school. And I've always looked back on that and felt kind of ashamed of that, after serving, looking back on that, I wish that it had just been out of the sense of like not looking at, what am I going to get out of this? Because it's such a privilege for me just to have been born here. All the opportunities that we have that we just don't even realize we're afforded on a daily basis. And then I really wish that I had gone into it thinking of, I owe something to this country with no expectation of anything in return. And I got also just so much more out of it than college.
Right.
Just the life experiences and the relationships made with the guys I served with. It was really invaluable.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, and I've told this story a couple of times on the podcast. I mean, I was like you. Now, I was in ROTC, but I made all these decisions prior to 9/11. And the only reason I did ROTC is because I went to a fairly expensive private school, and I needed the scholarship to help pay for it. I mean, I didn't ever envision that I would do anything beyond my 4-year commitment to the military and would never look back. And it was just a means to an end for me. And so it has worked out entirely different. And here I am sitting nearly almost 20 years later into a military career, wondering how the hell I'm still here. And I, like you, feel the same way. I wish I had more noble intentions when I first signed up. I recall a lot when I was a senior in college and I had all my fellow classmates going to job fairs and things of that nature. And they're like, aren't you going to job fairs? I'm like, no. And they're like, why? I'm like, because I have to go in the military after. That's what you do in ROTC. You go on active duty. And they said, well, why don't you get a real job? I mean, little did they know that, a real job happened in 2001 when 9/11 changed the world. But that was just kind of the mentality back then. So I certainly can empathize and sympathize with what you were feeling. But sometimes, not only does the Lord work in mysterious ways, but the Army has a tendency kind of to give back to you what you put into it one way or another.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't look down on that motivation at all. I mean, we all join for different reasons, right? Some people join for college, some for citizenship, others, because they don't know what I want to do, whatever the reasons. It kind of doesn't matter because once you get there, you're all in it for each other.
Right.
And all that just fades away and you find your purpose.
So when you went in, did you have anybody else in your family who was in the military, or were you walking into boot camp having no idea what you were getting into?
walking in, no idea what I was getting into.
What did you expect?
Oh, geez. I don't know. It's funny. I always think about that I think about going into boot camp and as a civilian with no, background on it. I think you're going to go in and I'm going to come out the other side like this, just absolute warrior. And it's really boot camp is like tearing down the house and building a foundation. You're going to learn how to march. You're going to learn how to zero your weapon. But the real meat of everything that happens is when you hit your unit. And I heard one of the other guests talking about it. Might have been Joel talking about, it feels like prison. Yeah. Like with guns, your life is not your own. You don't get to make any decisions. You don't get to choose when you sleep, when you eat, any of those things. And it was just a rude wake up call from, the relatively easy life that I had led up to that point.
And that's funny. The Joel you referenced, Joel Carpenter, a previous guest on the Hazard Ground, he was in Hollywood. Like he was in Southern California and decided to get into the Army, and all of a sudden that world changes rather quickly. So sometimes it's a culture shock for all of us. Now, when you get out of basic training, what's your first assignment? Where are you going? And like this sounds like it's your first foray away from being home. Is that the case?
Yeah, no, that is the case. I mean, I'd never been on a plane before I went to basic training. And I'd never been, and this is comical, I'd never been further west than the state of New York. And I went to Oklahoma for basic training. I mean, that in of itself was a huge wake up call from the hills of New Hampshire to, the plains of Oklahoma, I guess. And when I went in, I went in just kind of knees of the Army. I'd gone in as a 13 Fox, as a forward observer, and not picked a duty station. I wasn't airborne or anything like that. And when they were there, they asked for volunteers for airborne. They tell us all the you're going to jump out of planes. Oh yeah, and by the way, if you end up in an airborne unit on jump stats, you get an extra $150 a month. Yeah. Well, as a private making $900 a month before taxes, an extra $150 sounded like a pretty good deal to me. And jumping out of planes sounded cool, so I raised my hand for that. And after basic, found myself at airborne school in Fort Benning. And came down. My duty station was going to the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vicenza, Italy.
Beautiful place. Lucky. But so you as a field artillery guy, that's what a 13 Fox is. And you basically are putting a lot of heavy rounds all the way downrange on the enemy. What year is this as far as where we are in the War on Terror when you get to Italy?
I get to Italy in February of 2004. And for a little context, at that point, the 173rd was just getting ready to come back. And, for me, I was excited to be going to this airborne unit, this elite unit. But at the same time, I'd watched enough movies to know, like, you don't want to be the replacement. And these guys had just jumped into northern Iraq, about a year before, just in the spring of my senior year. So that's right around when I was getting there.
So when do you get to your first actual deployment? And is it Iraq or Afghanistan?
First deployment is Afghanistan. I was there with the 173rd for a little over a year training up, and we deployed to my first deployment in the spring of 2005 to southwestern Afghanistan.
All right. So when you get there, now you're a long way from New Hampshire. Obviously, this is sights and things that you've never seen before. What were you thinking and feeling when you got to that first deployment, and what was your mission?
I mean, I remember we did all this train up, we had all this experience of these guys that had been to Iraq, and I felt good going into it with the leadership we had really at every level. And, excited in the sense that we're getting to go do our jobs. There's that fear of, I don't want to let my buddies down. This is what we trained for. We're going to do, I guess the Super Bowl,
right? No,
for a soldier as you train. And, I'd always taken my job very seriously as a forward observer, recognizing that, our job's to help bring big guns to support the infantry. I was attached to an infantry company, and, at the same stroke that we could play a big role in the battlefield, the importance of being good at our jobs, because if we make a mistake, a lot of good people can get injured or killed, if we get around in the wrong place. So, a lot of nerves and a lot of nerves just from that aspect, but also just, I had no idea what we were getting into just going to Afghanistan. I mean, it was like going back in time, people living in mud huts without electricity or running water. And it was just surreal is the best word to use.
What sort of enemy contact did you encounter on that deployment, and what was that experience like? Because obviously you'd done the train up, but, real combat live fire is totally different.
Yeah, I mean, I learned more in my first 30 days on the ground there than I did in the 2 years before. Not knocking the 2 years before, because our leaders did a hell of a job training us up and preparing us. But as you probably know, you learn so much more there being in it. Went into that deployment at that time. The focus was on Iraq, Afghanistan. I kind of felt was like an afterthought. We're thinking we're going to go there and hand out blankets and beans. And yeah, we did some of that, but we got into plenty of fights. Our first one, I think we got there in April of 2005. We were in our first major firefight on May 3rd, 2005, in the Arghandab Valley. And our scout platoon had gotten into contact. They had a Humvee that was damaged and on fire, and we got spun up as QRF. And, that is in itself just, totally disorienting as you're scrambling to get your stuff up to the helipad and, just get ready to go out there, and you're running off the back of this helicopter, not knowing what you're getting yourself into. We ended up fighting all day through the night into the next day. And, I guess coming out of that, it just was I don't even really know how to describe that experience. It took me a couple of days to process what we had been through.
When you think back to it, what do you remember most about that whole experience?
I think it was incredible to me that in all this chaos, because the battlefield was just absolute chaos. They landed us on opposite sides of the river. Our third platoon went in on one side, and they split up our platoon, and I was with part of first platoon on the other side of the river. Just that out of all this chaos, we were all marching to the same drum beat, and just everybody working together and continuing to move fire. And, we had people get wounded and go down, and guys ran forward to treat them. And, first set a perimeter and fire back in the enemy. That just how much everybody fell back on their training and did exactly what they were supposed to do. And in all this chaos, when everybody should be, ducking for cover, these guys are standing up and firing back. And, it just amazed me how everybody just kind of lifted each other up. And you learn that whatever you thought you were capable of before, you're capable of a whole lot more.
Well, and that kind of leads, I don't want to get too far into July 13th, 2008, but when you see your fellow platoon mates and squad mates and do that sort of thing, how much does it really affect you mentally to say, well, it's when the time comes, I'll do the same thing?
It's expectations, right? I mean, you come into the unit, and there was, stories of guys before I even got there. I just always remember the story of Sergeant Holbrook and these guys in first platoon that had been ambushed in Iraq. And Sergeant Holbrook, I think, had been shot in the stomach, and he drove the Humvee back to the base.
Wow.
Right? So you hear stories like that, and he was with us on that deployment. And you see these guys do that, and you understand that, like, that's the legacy of our unit. That is the expectation. And you want to live up to that. You don't want to let the guys down around you, and you know that they're going to do that for you. You owe it to them to do the same.
Did you ever ask him about that experience?
No.
See, that's like me. I would have walked out and said, listen, hey, man, so you got shot in the stomach and drove home? Like, I'm just curious what was going through your head. Like, were you in pain? You never had the urge to talk to him?
No, but I mean, even on that deployment, so, there was a fast forward just 1 month, June 21st, there was a massive firefight. Our guys were in a village and had basically, stirred the hornet's nest and ended up fighting up this hill. And there was this other guy. He got shot right around his collarbone, and this round had gone in there, traveled along his chest cavity, and exited out his ribs, but it didn't hit any of his vital organs. I mean, that guy walked down off the mountain, and all the guys around him continue to fight and keep their cool and do what they're supposed to do. Those things, I guess, motivate you, because you're just like, I hope that when the time comes, I hope I have the medal that those guys did.
Did you lose anybody on that deployment?
We did. We lost one guy, Staff Sergeant Michael Schaefer. Okay, and
so what was that experience?
That was it was July 25th, 2005, and I had never lost anybody before, and that shook me, especially when you lose somebody in combat, it's because somebody else has taken their life. But he was just another guy we QRF'd out to support this special forces unit that had gotten in contact in this village. We were on QRF or RC South in Afghanistan at that point. And we started clearing this village when all hell broke loose, and guys were just popping out of the ground. And all over the place. And there was this one room that led down underground, and the platoon leader's, asking, who's going to clear it. And he gets ready to get in the door, and Sergeant Schaefer grabs him and says, "Hey, you're the lieutenant. You're not doing that." And guy stacks up on him, and they go down these stairs. And as they round the corner, there's two enemy in the room, and just the way it was, Schaefer tried to push his team leader back and was shot. And his team leader, scrambled back out and told us what was going on. Another guy went down to try and get him, and he got shot. And we ended up popping smoke, and more guys went in there, and we got Sergeant Schaefer out, but he had been killed at that point. But it also amazed me on that day how, this one guy, Sergeant Schaefer, had been killed. We didn't know it at the time, but another guy had been wounded trying to go down in there. It's dark. Nobody knows what's going on. And when the guys kept going down in there was smoke. They dropped a smoke grenade in there. And, guy after guy was lining up to run down in there. And you couldn't really take your weapon if you were going to grab them, or you couldn't have it at the ready. It was, go try and grab them and drag them out. And these guys lined up and they did it.
Wow.
But that was a hard day for us. We were in a number of firefights on the deployment. We had a lot of guys wounded, but Sergeant Schaefer was the only guy that we lost.
At what point, when that happens with that regularity, does your mindset start to shift? We talk about it a lot on the podcast. My first deployment, I ran over 75 combat convoys throughout Iraq, and there are certain days I just would wake up, and this is so you're basically figuring one every 3 or 4 days if you're there for a year, and you wake up and you're like, well, today's the day, because bad stuff is going to happen. It's only a matter of time for you can roll the dice so many times before you throw a bad number, so to speak. What was that like for you?
I don't know. I guess I didn't really think about that much. I mean, when you have all this time ahead of you in the deployment, you're 3 months in and there's 9 months to go or whatever. It's just, I always took it as day to day, as chow, as breakfast, lunch, dinner, repeat. And I tried not to think too much beyond just the day I was in. You couldn't really even think about the end. And I mean, I guess I didn't really think too much of my own end. I mean, seeing that I think we all knew that it was a possibility. But you can't dwell on it. I mean, we all had a job to do, and just there's guys relying on you, and you're relying on them.
It's interesting. Not many people have. I mean, everybody has that approach of kind of just taking a day at a time, but there's always a sense, because combat's so random. There's always a sense that your number could be called.
Yeah, and I heard you talk about that on one of your other podcasts, and I agree. I mean, there's a measure of luck in it. There's no rhyme or reason. Sometimes it's not because a guy was, doing the wrong thing or bad at their job. It happened that day. And sometimes, it happens because the guys are good at their job.
Yeah. And
because
sometimes
they're out there doing exactly
right.
They're pushing the envelope, and they're leading by example, and they're putting themselves out there for their brothers. And, for me, I think if anything, that's always motivated me and the guys I serve with, because we see them putting that sort of dedication forward, that we owe it to them to honor them by at least matching it to the best of our ability.
Okay, so this deployment ends, you get back and you start to regroup. When is it, and what was it like trying to reintegrate back into normal life again?
So I think we redeployed back would have been March of 2006. Time frame around that time. And I remember, you're all excited to get back, because that's all you're thinking about. Our leaders, they were very good about, putting in our heads, hey, guess what? We're not done until we're boots on the ground back in Italy. So don't think that you're done here. There's no chance that we could get called out, regardless of how close to the end we are. But it came, and excited. But I remember getting off the bus, and I think there was a number of us this happened to, and they dismissed us from formation, and now I'm just like, all right, now what do I do? What do I do with myself? And I remember going back to my room and just thinking, like, I put my gear down. I'm like, okay, so now what? Like, I don't have to clean a weapon. I don't have to get my gear, get ready for the next mission. I don't have to sit through an op order. Like, what? It was almost foreign to kind of have that freedom again. And just to go from this environment where you're always ready for a fight, at any time, and you could get called out at any time, to just peace. And I think I had the same idea everybody else did. I went over to the PX. I was like, let's spend some of this deployment money.
What'd you buy?
I don't remember. It's probably like an Xbox or something.
It's good enough. It's a worthwhile purchase.
Probably Taco Bell, so I could get some real food.
It always boggled my mind when people would buy like TVs at the PX. I'm like, how are you getting that thing home? Like when they were on deployment, you know? I'm like, how are you getting that thing home? What are you doing with that thing? So anyway, but the strange thing soldiers do with a lot of money on a deployment and boredom. It's a bad combination, soldier with money and boredom. All right, so when you start getting trained back up, when do you get notified that you're going back, back over, and what's that whole situation like?
I mean, we knew. I mean, at that point in time, 2006, everybody's on the same rotation of you're home for a year, you're gone for a year. You're either on deployment or you're getting ready for the next one. And we knew it was coming. We didn't know exactly when, but we knew we had 12 to 15 months before we were going back. And for me, I had enlisted for 4 years originally, and I was gonna get stop lossed. And I actually ended up being stop lossed. I think my ETS date was like 3 months after we were in Afghanistan. And I mean, the train up, it helped having that first deployment because I don't want to say I took it that much more seriously, but I understood the importance of it that much more, right? That every training opportunity was important. I had seen on the first deployment, just, at any time, you have a dedicated medic to your platoon, but, anybody can be a medic at any point, right? And just the importance of cross training. And I think that just bled over to how I tried to train the soldiers that I was responsible for to try and make sure that they knew their job really better than I did, sooner than I did. I wanted them to be a better private than I was. And, understanding the importance of PT. I mean, they PT'd the hell out of us before we went, knowing that we were going to be climbing mountains. And so we took the same approach, getting ready for the second deployment.
The second deployment is back to Afghanistan. What time frame is this?
Yeah, we deployed around the same time, I think May of 2007 is when we deployed. And this time we deployed to northeastern Afghanistan. We were in Nuristan, Kunar province.
What was your mission this time around?
Same thing. Support the government, find the enemy, and destroy them. This was different from our first deployment. We were down in Zabul province in Kalat, and that was there were mountains, but we were along Highway 1, and you drove over this relatively flat terrain a while before you got to the mountains, and we weren't walking the mountains that much. Fast forward to this deployment where we're at, and the valleys where we were probably no more than a kilometer wide, and it went straight up to the biggest mountains I'd ever seen. And we walked a lot, and it felt like a very different fight. I mean, our first deployment, we air assaulted a lot. I felt like we had the enemy on their heels. We surprised them a lot, with pre-dawn air assaults. This time it was like you couldn't leave your fob without the enemy kind of knowing, okay, they're going somewhere.
I feel like after your first deployment, you go into this one much more alert, much more, I don't want to say cautious per se, but you go into it with more just awareness about all the things that can happen. Did that help or hurt you in a certain sense?
No, I think it absolutely helped. I mean, we had the opportunity when we were training in Germany for the unit that we would be ripping with. Some of their leadership came back and gave us the lay of the land. And so we had an idea of, the tenacious type of enemy that we were going to be fighting. And that was a huge help. And just, the discipline from the first one of understanding, just always do things by the book, do things right. When I think about, some of our leadership, it wasn't always fun, but, you'd walk up. We weren't going to be in the valley if we didn't have to. If you weren't in a Humvee, you'd climb for an hour, 2, 3 hours, and then you would move out. We weren't going to give the enemy the opportunity to have the high ground, if it was at all possible to avoid. And, that was, that affected us a lot.
This deployment was the one ultimately, that you were awarded the Medal of Honor for, but that didn't happen until the very end of the deployment. So what happens in the time in between? Are you seeing as much combat? Are you seeing as much enemy fire and things of that nature throughout the whole thing as you did on your first deployment, or was it different from that standpoint?
So my platoon was at the battalion FOB in Nagalam, and we did a lot of road patrols. But our other sister companies and our other platoon, really particularly at the beginning of the deployment, our sister companies like Battle Company and people I'm sure have heard of Restrepo. That was our sister company, Battle Company, and they were getting in contact almost every day. Able Company was being in contact almost every day. The guys running the supply, the guys and the men and women running the supply routes were getting in contact constantly. For our platoon, it was quieter. I don't really remember much contact, through the initial summer for our platoon. That being said, our second platoon was located, I want to say they were probably about 20, 25 kilometers north in the upper Wago Valley. And where they were at, they were operating two bases, Bella Outpost and Ranch House. And both of these fire bases really could only be resupplied by helicopter. They could only be accessed by helicopter. You couldn't get there by Humvee. And in August of 2007, the enemy conducted a major assault on Ranch House. They had actually breached the wire and infiltrated about half of the base before our guys were able to repel them. And I mean, they were doing gun runs inside the wire of this base, and that was something we had never seen before. I mean, we had been in fights before, but nothing like that, because this base was on the side of a mountain. I mean, just hanging off. The helicopter landing zone was the roof of this building built into the side of the mountain. If a Chinook came in, it couldn't even land all the way because the wheels would go through the roof. They were staying at max power to kind of almost like hover land. And this, we just knew, especially after that fight, that this was going to be like nothing we had experienced before. And even after that, in November, we had broken down Ranch House at that point, and First Platoon was still occupying Bella Outpost, and they had done a patrol back to the village of Aranis, where Ranch House had been previously, had stayed overnight, and on the way back, they were ambushed. And, we hadn't lost anybody at Ranch House. We had guys get wounded, but we ended up losing 6 guys on that patrol back. And
were you on that patrol as well, or no?
I was not on that patrol, but that is the patrol that Kyle White was on.
Gotcha.
Another Medal of Honor recipient from our company. And our platoon was QRF to go out there and help with the support and the recovery. And I remember going out there and seeing that ground, and it was just the absolute worst ground you ever possibly could have fought on. It was just this goat trail in this valley, and the enemy had taken the high ground. And I mean, hearing the stories of what those guys did was absolutely incredible. But after that, our platoon ended up going up and ripping out with First Platoon and taking over Bella Outpost.
For those who aren't military, who are listening and who have never been to Afghanistan, even if you are military and you haven't been there, it's really indescribable, the terrain. It's just, for the average person who lives in America, you'll see nothing like it anywhere in the world. There's a solid chance two Afghan villagers who live a mile apart, separated by the terrain, would never see each other in their lifetimes, just because you can't traverse the terrain without really wanting to. And that plays a pivotal part in a lot of the major conflicts in Afghanistan, as you can speak to, Ryan, just because the terrain and the high ground is so important in battle. And the guy on the high ground has a much better advantage point than the guy on the low ground. And most of the places where we had to stay were on low ground because that's where the valleys were. It's where you could put buildings and things. And so we were automatically putting ourselves at a disadvantage from people who had lived there their entire life. And I think that creates a certain, there's a certain comfort for the enemy in knowing the terrain better than we did.
Yeah, absolutely. And freedom of movement. I mean, in their country, they're not wearing uniforms.
Yeah.
Right. So if they put down their weapons, they can come in and observe and watch and then go back and develop their plans. And to a certain extent, you're somewhat fighting on their terms.
From where Bella was, and I think the other outpost there was called Blessing, if I remember reading correctly.
Yeah.
Okay. So that position, you said, was on the side of a mountain. When you went to backfill the platoon that was there and you got there, I mean, how remote are we talking? I mean, are there hard stand showers and buildings, or are you guys just kind of really in austere conditions at that point?
It was like the Wild West out there. So Ranch House was the base that was on the side of a mountain.
Okay.
And for their living conditions, they were basically, those guys were living in sheds,
Oh, wow.
and
Okay.
taking camp showers, filling up those bags,
Yep.
laying it out on a rock and showering, when they could, eating MREs every day because there was no hot chow out there, and just, guard rotations and patrol. That was life. I mean, it was a smoker just walking from the lower end of the post to the upper end of the post. I mean, you might climb 200 meters in elevation or more.
Wow.
Just moving that far. And then Bella Outpost was in the base of the valley, just I don't know, maybe 10 clicks from Ranch House, maybe less. But this is all still like so far removed from Blessing. You really felt like you were out on the edge of the world,
Okay.
by yourself. And Bella was the base itself. I mean, same sort of conditions. I mean, the buildings were just almost like sheds that people lived in on, plywood bunk beds. The whole base was built around the HLZ, and the whole base itself there could fit inside a football field. I mean, the perimeter, it's right up against the river on one side and road on the other, and you're looking straight up. And we had an OP called OP1, about 200, 300 meters up the mountain. Same deal. You're living in sheds. You're doing your guard rotations, and they were really the tip of the spear when any sort of attack kicked off there. We'd take a rocket or get in enemy contact. And it really was like the Wild West out there.
So it's embracing the suck of the suck, so to speak.
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
It's it's one of those things where, but you're out on your own, and you're kind of like fully living, in the mission. So I mean, it wasn't without its benefits, I guess.
Yeah, and I just want people to understand, even whether military or not, just to understand the conditions and obviously living that lifestyle, for lack of a better term. Sometimes it can grate on guys, right? I mean, you can have kind of breakdowns in societal norms, if you will. Guys get more irritable, because they don't have creature comforts and things of that nature. Did any of that go on?
I didn't see it.
Okay.
I think if more than anything, it brought us closer together because you're living on top of each other, and really the only entertainment you have is the guys that you're with. And being up at the OP, as hard as it was, we did guard, and then, we shot the breeze together, waiting for a fight to happen. And as hard as that was, I think it made us more cohesive.
I can see that. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And some of that comes from your leadership more than anything, right? If you have good leadership that's taking care of you guys and everything else, it makes it a lot easier to deal with those conditions. We've had people on this podcast who have lived in the similar conditions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've seen breakdowns, and most of that is due to bad leadership.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've looked at it, and it was a huge lesson for me, is here you have this horrible situation, not great living conditions, the threat of always being in a fight, but the people that you were with can make it. I mean, it's strange to look back and say, I had some of the best times of my life with the guys I served with in those conditions, right? And at the same time, you can have something that's great, but if you have the wrong people together, it can be awful.
No, 100% true. Perfectly stated. Okay, so let's fast forward. You have now moved up to where we call it a combat outpost Bella. Is that technically what it was?
Yep.
Okay, so you're at Combat Outpost Bella. How long were you there for before July 13th, 2008?
So we went up in November, and we ended up staying there through the spring, and eventually ended up leaving and heading back to Blessing. And when we were at Blessing, as we had been talking for the previous year about, our leadership had wanted to break down Ranch House and Bella because it was just so far out there, so hard to resupply, so hard to reinforce if there was a large attack like what had happened with the Ranch House attack, that we had wanted to break those down and move up into the village of Wanat. And as we knew the next unit coming in was going to be manned less than we were, they were going to have less combat experience, that now is the kind of the time with, after breaking down Ranch House, the enemy, the attacks were stepping up at Bella, the intel was indicating more so that they were going to try and do another ranch style type attack to overrun the base. And just with the difficulties of supply and reinforcing that, the decision made, hey, it's time. We're not getting any benefit out of this. We're keeping guys up there just, to get shot at and fight back. And we're all doing the best we can, but the best decision to make our mission successful would be to move back to Wanat, be closer to the center of government for that region, and affect the people in that way. And so it was decided when we got towards the end there that we would break down Bella and simultaneously move up to Wanat.
Okay. And let me just understand, just from your viewpoint alone, with Bella being where it was and it not serving any purpose, was it a leadership thing that denied you guys from doing it sooner? Or was it just something that you needed the time to plan? Because from what I'm understanding, what I'm gathering from the reading and both talking to you is that, as you said, I mean, this thing was pretty exposed and the enemy had a lot of time to coordinate attacks. And that's typically not common for them. I mean, most of their ambushes were hasty, right? But you guys were facing coordinated attacks because it was such a weakened position. Am I correct in that?
I think coordinated attacks were commonplace just even in that region. I mean, I think our battle company ran into it. Able company ran into it. I didn't fully understand the delays until actually much later. There's a book that's been written about it, and in reading the book, learning about, just the politics that happened even just with the Afghan government, and having to get approval to close bases and resources. To close the base and airlift it out of there. The theater at that point, I think there were that was a commonplace in a lot of places. There were a lot of units that had these remote outposts that the idea was to spread out and take the fight to the enemy. And it had changed a little bit in the strategic intent of, pulling back to maybe some population centers. So it was a mix of resources and politics, I guess, without, fully knowing about it. That's just been my understanding of it.
All right, take me through the events, let's say a week to 10 days out before July 13th. You guys are closing down Bella and you're reconsolidating back. So when you get the word that this is happening, is there like a sense of relief finally, or what was kind of everybody's mentality?
It wasn't a sense of relief. I mean, to be honest, at that point, we were about, we're saying 2 weeks before we go, we're a month from going home.
Okay.
And we knew we were going to spend our final, 2, 3, 4 weeks standing up this new base. There was going to be nothing there. We were going to pull security while, contractors came in and started building this new base. And we knew that, breaking down Bella, these guys are just going to come down the valley and attack Wanat. And from our standpoint, we thought, the smart thing to do for them would be to hit us before we have really our defensive positions set, permanent in this village, set up pescos and have started building real fortifications. But, at the same time, we understood that, we're not done until we're done. And part of it was, it's our job to set up the next unit for success as well. And we still had a mission to do. And so we spent those, 2 weeks leading up to it, preparing, coming up with the plans, doing our sand tables and our op order and getting all our supplies in order to go up and execute the mission.
How achievable did you think this mission was when it was laid out?
We thought it was achievable. I mean, the idea, Bella's going to break down. Those guys are going to come. First platoon's going to pull out of there. We're going to move up to Wanat. We had contractors laid on to bring in heavy equipment. We were going to set up pescos. We had engineers coming in. we were going to have our gun trucks. There was nothing saying it's going to be easy, but nothing's easy in the military.
Sure. How much were attacks picking up, or was it steady in the days and weeks leading up to June 13th?
Bella, they were picking up. And we're not. There had been, our leadership and our platoon had done some patrols in the months leading up. And there had been some more. We had gone up before over the previous year and never really been attacked. And they were getting attacked pretty regularly going up there. In the months leading up to us moving to Wanat, as the enemy, I think, probably understood that was, our intent.
I mean, you kind of were signaling that to them one way or another?
I mean, we're going up and having, meetings with the village elders and working on the plans to set up, basically in the center of this village. And it's hard to tell who's friend or foe.
Sure. Yeah. And in certain cases that, you think those meetings are helping you, but they could be hurting you, as you mentioned before. None of them wearing a uniform, so it's hard to tell who's what and who does what when you're not looking. Did the intelligence that you were getting there lend to the fact that this was, was the best decision overall as far as for combat power and economy of force and things of that nature?
I mean, I was an E5
Okay.
at the time, so it wasn't like I'm sitting in the talk hearing this intel. But from the way that it was explained down to us, yes, it made sense that we have this unit coming in that's going to have lower manpower, less experience. We can't just break down Bella and have nothing, no presence up there, especially by this what was kind of like the district government there. And so, yeah, it made sense to what we were doing.
All right, so you go to bed on the night of July 12th, 2008, expecting what to happen on July 13th?
Oh, so I think we went up on July 10th. And I think the whole time we're up there, every morning, we do our stand to, get up before the sun came up. I mean, every day was, we were expecting this is going to be the day that we're going to have, a significant attack. But I think at that point, we'd kind of started to think like, okay, maybe they are going to wait. But we weren't any less vigilant because of that. And we woke up that morning. We were going to do a patrol that day, and we had woken up early as we always did before the sun's up, doing our stand to, pulling our security, actively scanning. And sun had been up for a little while. At this point, we had a tow missile truck that had been attached to us from our testing company, and they were scanning with the tow and had spotted some guys up in the mountains. I think this would have been to the west and pretty high up. And I mean, nobody goes for just a hike in Afghanistan. There's no pleasure hiking over there. You're up there because you're going somewhere. You're going up there to fight and shoot down on somebody. And about that time, I'm getting ready to work up a fire mission because, we see weapons on these guys and we think they're getting ready to attack. And right around that time, I can remember standing up. I was in this observation post that was just outside the village. The way we had set up when we went in was we set up our vehicles in this open field in the middle of the village, right next to kind of the hotel and the bazaar and all that stuff. And that's where our main force was. We had another squad kicked out to run a TCP on the traffic control point on the road. And then we had this small observation post that was about 150 meters outside the post, a little bit further up on this spur.
Is that what was referred to as OP topside?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And for anybody who's going to research it, OP topside is what you're talking about. Okay.
Yep. And it really was just a series of sandbag fortifications on these terraces because the hills, this was in this village in Afghanistan, kind of in general, they build these terraces on the mountains so they can farm, just these flat stepped terraces. And we had built our fortifications there. So we had established OP topside using, the kind of the natural terrain to have like a sleeping quarters that had cover. And then higher up on the terraces were a number of sandbag fortifications. And as I'm standing there,
and that was just, I'm sorry to cut you off, but just on that OP topside was at a higher elevation, so you could look down over where you were building the post, correct?
So it wasn't that high. I mean, by doctrine, it wasn't where you'd want to put an observation post. We would have wanted higher terrain. And in talking our Lieutenant Brostrom, his methodology. I mean, at this point in time, we hadn't built significant fortifications. I mean, we'd been hand digging in the days leading up, filling sandbags by hand, and this is July, so it's probably 100 when we're waking up, and 110, 115. Once the sun's in the sky, and we'd been doing our best to build these fortifications, but he didn't want it so far out that it couldn't be reinforced. Just from what we had seen at Ranch House with the enemy trying to they weren't just trying to fire, they were trying to overrun. And the same kind of deal had happened with Battle Company in the Korengal, where they had tried to capture one of our guys, and out of that incident is where Sal Genta was awarded the Medal of Honor. So his thinking was, a little bit further out, so maybe we have a little bit more visibility, just, provide a little bit more warning for the base, but not so far away that it couldn't be reinforced.
Makes sense. Okay. So you are at OP topside when you wake up that morning?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And like I had said, we're getting ready. I was working up the fire mission. This is, the sun had probably been up for 30 minutes or so, we're getting ready to do this fire mission when all of a sudden it's just this burst of machine gun fire rang out from the north, and the observation post was just rocked by rocket propelled grenades and hand grenades. And just, it felt like the air was exploding, everything, and the whole base was being hit. I mean, they were being RPG'd, and it was just like the world exploded. And at that point, I was wounded right off the bat. I got thrown into one of the fighting positions and had taken shrapnel to my legs, and I had my bell rung, and I was just disoriented. And all the guys, there were other guys, and one guy, Gunner's Willing, was killed in the opening volley, but all the other guys in the post, I mean, immediately started just firing back and fighting back. And it took me, a minute just to kind of get my bearings and figure out what was going on. I just looked down at my legs, and I could see, all these shrapnel holes in my BDU bottoms, and, even in my boots. And I remember looking down and, trying to move my legs, and couldn't, just telling myself, hey, just wiggle your feet, move your legs. And I couldn't. And I saw this large hole on my inner thigh, and we had done so much training leading up. Everybody, in our unit was able, did tourniquet, knew how to do a needle chest decompression, treat a second chest wound, IVs, all that. And, knew enough about the anatomy to know that, the major artery that runs through the inside of your leg, that I thought, there's a chance maybe that's hit. I got to get a tourniquet on this leg, but I had taken some shrapnel in my left arm and didn't really feel like I could work the tourniquet on my own. And I could hear other guys fighting. And I was in the northernmost position, and crawled to the southern position where Specialist Jason Bogar was. And he's standing up, returning fire. I could see the other team leader that was in the observation post, Matt Gobble. He had been hit with shrapnel. He's wounded. Bogar turns around and looks at me, and he can see, all these shrapnel wounds and me bleeding all over the place. And looks at me, and he's asking me, hey, what do you need? I need a tourniquet. And he puts a tourniquet on my right leg. And I'm sure that saved my life, because, a lot of the trauma happened to my right leg. I think even if I hadn't hit my femoral artery, I would have bled out just from the amount of wounds that I had sustained there. And it always struck me how calm he was. This wasn't his first deployment. He had previously deployed, I believe, twice to Afghanistan with the National Guard, but then had come to our unit as a replacement. And, when I got into that position, he's standing up, firing right back on the enemy. He turns around, sees me, he treats me, and goes right back about his business. And that was always just amazing to me. And all the other guys around were doing the same thing. And these are junior guys. A lot of these guys, Bogar was a little bit older. I think he was 25, but the other guys up there were 21, 22, maybe. I think, some of them probably couldn't even buy a beer back in the States. And, in the absence of leadership, Gobble and I were the only two team leaders up there. And, none of these guys had been in a fight like this before. They just, fell right back on their training and knew exactly what they had to do and did it.
I'm sorry to cut you off. What strikes me, not only how calm Bogar was, as you said, but how calm you were. The idea that you're bleeding to a point that you need a tourniquet was you didn't go into shock. You didn't start to freak out mentally. You seem pretty calm about that whole decision. Because usually, for those who don't know, a tourniquet means you're going to lose the leg.
We had learned enough at that point. We had other guys get tourniquets. And I believe that deployment, other deployments, to know, like, all right, it's going to have to be on there a while without being treated. Okay. You lose the leg. But even if at that point, I'd rather lose my leg than lose my life.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. It's an easy decision when you put it that way. But I guess that's, it's hard to think about all that when people are still shooting at you.
I guess. I'd been in enough fights with the other guys to know that fear is contagious.
Sure. That makes sense.
It can be an infection in you if you let it take hold. And, I guess we'd always just been taught, just keep trying to do everything in your power to do your job. When I just thinking back to that first deployment and that story I mentioned earlier about that guy who took the round in the collarbone and exited out his ribs on the other side, and he walked himself down the mountain. How many people would just want to give up and be like, nope, I'll wait for a litter, and this guy, walked down. and I'm sure he wasn't just sitting there while he was fighting. And so it's just everybody's got to keep it together and think about the next thing that you can do. And I think, there's also, you draw strength from each other. I'm looking at Bogar, he's doing his job. All the other guys are, it's just, you just got to try and do your part too. And I talk about that, this in on our eastern flank, just above where I was with Bogar a little bit, was what we called our crow's nest position. It was just up another terrace, and it was a sandbag fortification. And that's where our gun team was. And these were all junior guys. Their team leader there was 22, maybe, Pruitt Rainey. And they were just manning their machine gun, returning fire right back on the enemy, trying to gain fire superiority. I know they were being hit with rocket propelled grenades, accurate, small arms fire. Pruitt, took control at that point and started directing his gun team and trying to get a handle on what was going on up at the observation posts. And so you got to contribute. And go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm just, I've seen visual depictions of the battle, and you're talking about what everybody's doing. And you said, the night sky lit up or whatever, it was just at dusk, and it seemed like it was coming from everywhere. I mean, all this was happening simultaneously. The attacks on OP outside, the attacks on the base itself, the attacks on the perimeter, all this was going on simultaneously. I mean, was it that coordinated of an attack where the first one fired, everybody started letting loose?
Yeah, it honestly, when I think back on it, it's like how we would initiate an ambush.
Right.
I mean, it was probably a closed bolt weapon. Started with a burst of probably AK fire, and then that was the signal for everybody. And they had us surrounded. They had the high ground. I've heard the estimates are anywhere between 150 and 300 enemy fighters. There was 49 of us on the ground. We were augmented with a platoon of 20 or 30 A&A and their Marine embed training team. But everybody, I mean, this wasn't just the OP being hit like this. All the gun trucks down on the main vehicle patrol base, I mean, they were getting slammed. There were bullets that, Mark 19s went down because they took, bullets through the feed tray covers. 50 cals went down. They were smart. I mean, they targeted the tow truck right off the bat. They concentrated RPGs on it, and credit to that crew. Those guys, Sergeant Grimm and May and Davis, they all stayed in that truck as long as they could. It caught on fire. And, it wasn't until they couldn't hold that position anymore that they, then vacated that truck and moved to other fighting positions.
We're going to pause Ryan Pitt's incredible story right here this week, as his story is very detailed and very lengthy. So we wanted to make sure that it's possible for people to listen to the podcast in a relatively easy amount of time. So we will pause right here in the middle of Ryan's story and pick it up next week on the Hazard Ground Podcast.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.